The military of the High Elves of Ulthuan stands apart probably as one of the best in the entire world of Warhammer fantasy. Their infantry are well regarded for their skill at arms, discipline, and high-quality arms and armor. Their cavalry, resplendent in ornate scale, can probably lay claim to being some of the best in the world. I would be so bold as to suggest that their navy is probably the singularly best in the entire world of Warhammer fantasy. So in many ways, the High Elves of Ulthuan have managed to build and keep a shining example of military might over the thousands of years that they've been around. If the Elven army has one real weakness, and I think it is an important one, it's their relatively lackluster artillery. In today's video, I'm going to explore this weakness.
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
So, if I'm talking about Elven artillery, I'm really only talking about one thing: the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower. In some ways, it's actually a pretty remarkable war machine, as it's been in the game since Warhammer Armies 3rd edition. In-universe, the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower is even more ancient, with claims of the weapon dating back all the way to the time of Anarion, the first Phoenix King from several thousand years in the past. That the weapon has remained unchanged for thousands of years is a testament to the skill of the elves, but also, of course, their conservatism. As I see it, there are a few significant reasons why the elves of Ulthuan have kept the bolt thrower around, and I'd like to discuss some of them as a way of illustrating some of the more inefficient aspects of the elven military system. The first one, I think, is obviously social conservatism. I know we have a stereotype in the community that the dwarves are all stubborn grouches who balk at the idea of any kind of change, but by comparison, the dwarves are positively progressive. Yes, they still keep around crossbows and stone throwers, but dwarves have incorporated gunpowder technology into their society to a rather remarkable degree. Consider that in about 2,500 years, the Empire of Man went from dwelling in almost Iron Age tribes to near-industrial level armies. The High Elves have remained remarkably similar for their much longer existence. A High Elf soldier in the current timeline is more or less the same as one 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. High Elves see the passage of time differently to humans, of course. Their long lifespans mean that they observe and feel the flow of time differently to baseline humans. But that's still basically no real change, isn't it? The elves developed their military system from Anarion, fighting against endless tides of demons during the First Great War of Chaos. While costly, this war laid the foundations for what the High Elf military system would become, and they haven't really deviated from it in all this time. Perhaps it's because the model still works, but I can't help but imagine that it's more a product of their social desire to keep to the old ways than that the system itself is actually perfect. So if bolt throwers were invented around Anarion's time, then their need to innovate is largely stymied. After all, if it worked during the Great War of Chaos, then there's surely no need to change it now. But the thing about systems is that they work until they don't. The elves have so committed themselves to their particular way of war that if they weren't ever able to maintain it, I imagine that their entire society would crumble around them. Which of course leads me to my next reason: Doctrine. The elves learned how to make war during a very unique time in Warhammer Fantasy's history. I would argue that the trauma inflicted upon them during the First Great War of Chaos probably has never truly healed, and thus this event has shaped their military thinking forever after. The problem is, those circumstances were largely very specific. During the First Great War against Chaos, the High Elves found themselves besieged on their island. Chaos demons, while tough, aren't exactly renowned for their use of armor, or really complicated field maneuvers, or especially fortifications. The High Elves were fighting a defensive war against an enemy that never really needed to be besieged or engaged in any protracted sieges of fortifications. The Chaos demons didn't maintain any fortresses, they tried to assail them. They would either win, that is the High Elves, and the demon army would be dissipated, or they would lose, and they'd have to retreat to another fastness from which the demons would have to launch another assault. In the following centuries, the High Elves would only heighten their preference for mobile warfare, developing their navy out with bolt throwers as their primary ranged armament. Although the High Elves can build impressive cities and fortifications, they never really needed to take other similar structures. Remember, for most of their history, the High Elves did not fight peer combatants. They didn't have to fight civilizations or societies that maintained fortresses and strongholds like they did. Their defenses were for holding off external threats, such that their highly mobile armies were able to be mobilized and then deal with the threat in kind. It also helps that for the early part of their history, the High Elves never fought each other. Until the coming of the Witch King, the Elves had no reason to fight each other or, of course, practice any siegecraft upon any of their cities. So the Elven military system basically puddles along until eventually, of course, we see some of the failures of this doctrine emerge during the War of the Beard. The Elves were never really able to besiege any dwarven fortifications, not any of the actual dwarven strongholds that were maintained in the mountains. It was generally considered to be suicidal on the part of the Elves to try and do these types of attacks, and the Elves were clearly woefully unequipped to do so. While the dwarves did not have access to gunpowder yet, they did have a much more refined understanding of siegecraft, as of course, the dwarves do not rely on mobile maneuver warfare for their military doctrine. Dwarven lines are generally speaking gun lines formed around static, relatively slow-moving, but very tough heavy infantry. Dwarves are not fast enough to rely on things like hit-and-run tactics. By necessity, they needed to adopt tactics of defense, which, of course, they can complement with increasingly more dangerous ranged weapons. When confronted with a foe whose style of warfare proved entirely alien to their own, the High Elven military system gridlocked. Ultimately, the invasion of Malekith collapsed their war efforts before they had a chance to suicidally throw themselves against the strongest walls in the world. Now, you might argue that the Elven military doctrine didn't need to evolve because, of course, bolt throwers are not intended to be their primary means by which the elves might engage in siege warfare. After all, the reason why the dwarves have access to all manner of siege weapons is precisely because they lack for the two things that high elves have traditionally used for ending their sieges, namely magic and dragons. Now, I don't think it's a reach to say that the high elves really depend on their mastery of magic and their access to dragons to make up for their lack of artillery. And that makes perfect sense, right? If you've got it, you use it. Magic allows elven wizards to perform feats that no canon could really hope to match in the world of Warhammer Fantasy, and, well, dragons are the perfect mobile artillery pieces. They're tough, fast-moving, and able to rain death down on foes on the ground. So, to some extent, the elves don't need to innovate in artillery because they already have the medieval fantasy version of long-range artillery and aerial bombing, respectively. Although, here's where I would kind of disagree. The elven mastery of magic was once almost entirely unchallenged, but it's not necessarily entirely dominant anymore. Yes, the elves still have some of the best wizards in the setting, but that doesn't automatically mean that their magic is A, 100% reliable, B, 100% effective, and C, 100% unchallenged. Chaos, especially, has the mean to field sorcerers and warlocks whose magical ability can very easily be enough to damper the elves' own. I've certainly played a lot of games of Warhammer Fantasy where my very own good elven mage nevertheless didn't do very much because the enemy was always able to dispel him. Or, perhaps, I simply couldn't control the winds of magic that day. Magic is, in the setting of Warhammer Fantasy, inherently unreliable, and anybody who thinks they can reliably control it is playing a fool's game. Remember, the elves are good at harnessing the winds of magic, but they are not its masters. Ultimately, they depend on the raw power of chaos flowing through the world for magic, just like everybody else does. As for dragons, it is true that dragons are pretty much decisive in most contexts. I know that a lot of discourse in the old world, for example, centers around how dragons basically changed the meta, but remember, in this actual lore of the game, dragons have been in decline for centuries. It's an oft-repeated fact that it's actually getting harder and harder to rouse dragons to war. Dragons are getting less frequent and less available to the elves as time goes by. For a civilization that measures its horizons in thousands of years, it's arguably very short-sighted of them to depend so heavily on dragons when they do not actually know if they could in the future. If your answer to the question of why not develop better artillery is the dragons will always be there, then I think you're engaging in a little bit of self-delusion. Not to mention that the other races of the world are making advancements of their own. This is not to say that the elves should give up on their bolt throwers. I rarely see any high elven list without them. What I'm advocating for here, what I'm suggesting really, is that the elves should have developed some new kinds of artillery that should maybe perhaps leverage their mastery of magic and craftsmanship that we already know that they have. I actually think the elves could come up with some pretty powerful war machines that, maybe went a little bit beyond their own horizons. I'm sure there are plenty of ways for a bolt to be thrown quickly. Would it somehow be less elven for them to have better, or maybe even more, diverse types of war machines? I don't really think so. It's kind of a similar thought that I have with regards to the dwarves having spears and pikes in their arsenal. I don't think it makes the dwarven army less dwarven for them to have spears or pikes. I think it just makes more sense for them to do that, and the fact that they don't, after all of this time, really probably speaks to a problem with their culture than, necessarily their ability to innovate. But of course, what do you think? Do you agree with me or not? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe and all of that. Until next time, take care.